Ethan Cole had learned how fast life could corner a man. One minute he was sitting under the blue glow of an office screen, trying to finish another forgettable ad campaign. The next, his phone was buzzing with news that his little girl had a fever again, and the rent was still late, and the stack of bills in his kitchen drawer was not getting any smaller. The building around him was quiet, all polished floors and cold glass, but his heart was beating hard enough to drown it out. He was halfway to the elevator when he ran straight into the woman everyone in the company feared. Papers flew across the floor. Her leather folder slid under a cabinet. Ethan dropped to his knees to help, already apologizing. Then she looked at him with calm gray eyes and said nothing at all. He did not know it yet. But 1 week later, that same woman would sit across from him and offer him a deal that could save his daughter's future or ruin what was left of his soul. It was 8:45 on a Monday night when Ethan's phone lit up on the corner of his desk. He grabbed it so fast he nearly knocked over his coffee. The voice on the other end belonged to Miss Harper from his daughter's daycare. Soft, tired, apologetic. She told him Daisy had a fever again. It was not high yet, but if it did not break by morning, she would need to be picked up early. Ethan closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. He said he would be there. He always was. When the call ended, he sat still for a moment in the dim office light. Rows of empty desks stretched around him. Most people had gone home hours ago. But Ethan was still there, writing slogans for products he could not afford, chasing deadlines that never seemed to lead anywhere better. 3 years. That was how long he had been doing this alone. 3 years since his wife, Marissa, had died after a long, ugly illness that had swallowed their savings and left behind more debt than Ethan could think about without feeling sick. Since then, life had become a string of numbers that never worked in his favor. Rent, daycare, groceries, medicine, late fees. He kept patching the leaks, but the whole boat still felt like it was sinking. He shut down his laptop, slipped on his jacket, and headed for the elevator. That was when he turned the corner too fast and slammed into someone. A leather portfolio hit the floor. Papers spread across the tile like white birds. "Oh no, I'm sorry," Ethan said at once. He crouched down, gathering the papers in hurried hands. Across from him, the woman bent with quiet control, not rushed, not flustered, as if nothing in the world had the power to surprise her. Ethan glanced up and froze. Vivian Cross, Vice President of Cross and Vale Creative. 30 years old, sharp as broken glass, the kind of woman who passed through the office like she owned the air. Maybe she did. Ethan handed her the papers. She took them with a cool, unreadable face. "Thank you," she said. No smile, no softness, just 2 clipped words. She turned and walked away. That should have been the end of it. But then Ethan noticed something near the base of the wall. A cream-colored envelope, half hidden beneath a filing cabinet. He picked it up and jogged after her. "Miss Cross?" She stopped and turned. He held out the envelope. "You dropped this." For the first time, something shifted in her expression. Not warmth, just attention. She took the envelope, opened her purse, and pulled out 5 crisp $100 bills. "Here," she said. Ethan stared at the money, then at her. "No." Her brow lifted slightly. "No?" "It's yours," he said. "I was just giving it back." She held the cash out 1 second longer. When he did not take it, she slid it back into her purse. Her eyes stayed on him like she was trying to understand a language she had not expected to hear. "Are you sure?" she asked. Ethan gave a tired little shrug. "Yeah, I'm sure." Then he turned and walked away before his pride could crack. What Ethan did not know was that Vivian Cross was not a woman who forgot things. Later that night, she sat alone in her office on the 36th floor and pulled up his employee file. Ethan Cole, junior copywriter, widower, one child. Financial history strained. No powerful friends in the company. No ties to her half-brother Gavin. No hidden alliances. No social standing that could complicate things. Vivian leaned back in her chair and studied his file in the glow of her screen. Clean. Desperate. Reliable. Useful. 7 days later, Ethan got an email from Human Resources asking him to report to the 36th floor at 9 in the morning. No explanation. No context. Just a meeting request with Vivian Cross's name attached to it. He read it 3 times. By the next morning, his stomach felt like a stone. He arrived 5 minutes early in the only suit he owned, one that pulled a little too tight at the shoulders. The executive floor was all glass walls, brushed steel, and silence. A receptionist with a perfect smile told him which conference room to enter. Vivian was already there. She sat at the far end of a long black table, hands folded, posture straight, expression calm. Morning light poured through the windows behind her, making the skyline shine like cold silver. She gestured to the chair across from her. Ethan sat. She wasted no time. "I reviewed your record," she said. "You're dependable, capable, quiet. You don't attract attention." Ethan swallowed. "I'm not sure if that's a compliment." "It isn't," she said, "but it's useful." He stared at her. Then she said the words that made his whole body go still. "I need you to pretend to be my husband for 1 year." For a second, Ethan thought he had heard her wrong. He let out a small breath. "I'm sorry." "What?" Vivian did not blink. "My father's will gave me control of this company with one condition. I must be legally married before my next birthday. If I'm not, control transfers to Gavin." Ethan stared at her, waiting for the punchline that never came. She continued in the same even tone. "My birthday is in 11 months. I need a husband on paper. Someone with no connection to my brother. Someone who can follow instructions. Someone who understands what's at stake. And you picked me." "Yes." "Why?" Her eyes held his. "Because you have every reason to say yes." Then she laid it all out. She knew about the medical debt. Knew he was behind on rent. Knew Daisy's daycare was barely covered. Knew exactly how close he was to falling apart. She said she could erase the debt, raise his salary, secure better health coverage, and set up a college fund for his daughter. In return, he would move into her penthouse, attend family dinners, smile for photographs, convince her brother, the board, and anyone else who mattered that they were real. Ethan felt heat rise in his face. "You investigated my life?" "I did," Vivian said. "You make that sound normal." "For me it is." He laughed once, but there was no humor in it. Then he asked the question sitting hot in his throat. "So, we're sharing a bed?" Vivian's face did not change. "Only if appearances require it." The room went very quiet. Ethan looked down at the folder she slid across the table. Legal terms, numbers, conditions. A year of his life priced out in neat black print. He thought of Daisy's small face burning with fever, Thought of the rent notice on his kitchen counter. Thought of waking up at 3 in the morning and doing math in the dark, always ending with the same answer: not enough. "I need 24 hours, he said. Vivian nodded once. "Take them." That night, Ethan sat beside Daisy's bed in his apartment and watched her sleep. The room was small. The paint near the window was peeling. Her stuffed dinosaur was tucked under one arm. She looked so little in the soft yellow light that his chest ached just looking at her. He thought about the life he was giving her. The hand-me-down shoes, the cheap cereal, the way he smiled through fear so she would never see how close he was to breaking. Then he thought about Vivian Cross, about her cold voice, her impossible offer, her perfect control. Security had never looked so much like a trap. Still, when he picked up his phone, his hands were shaking. He typed one message: "I'll do it, but my daughter stays private. No publicity, no using her for appearances." The reply came less than 2 minutes later. Agreed. Ethan stared at the screen for a long time after that. Then he set the phone down, leaned back in the chair beside his daughter's bed, and pressed a hand over his mouth. He had just sold a year of his life to a woman who looked at marriage like a business merger. And in the silence of that little room, with his daughter breathing softly in the dark, Ethan could not tell if he had just saved them both or stepped into something far more dangerous. 3 days later, Ethan signed the contract in a downtown law office that smelled like paper, leather, and old money. Everything was there in black and white. 1 year, full financial support, strict privacy, public appearances as husband and wife, no emotional expectations, no physical relationship unless circumstances demanded it. At the bottom sat the line where his name belonged. Ethan signed first. Vivian signed after him without hesitation. Then she stood and offered her hand across the polished table. He took it. Her grip was cool and steady. It felt less like the start of a marriage and more like the closing of a deal. He moved into the penthouse on a Friday. The place was so large it almost echoed. Clean lines, pale stone, glass walls, furniture that looked expensive enough to make him nervous. Nothing out of place. Nothing soft except the view of the city lights stretching past the windows. Vivian showed him to a guest room at the far end of the hall. "This is yours," she said. "The staff has your schedule. If we have appearances, I'll inform you in advance. Do not enter my office unless I ask. If my brother contacts you directly, tell me immediately." Ethan set his duffel bag down beside the bed. "Anything else?" Vivian looked at him for a moment. "Do not mistake this arrangement for something it isn't." He gave a tired nod. "Wouldn't dream of it." She left him there in a room bigger than his whole apartment. That Sunday, they attended their first family dinner at the Cross estate. The house sat outside the city, on a ridge lined with iron gates and old oak trees. The place looked less like a home and more like a warning. Ethan followed Vivian up the stone steps, his pulse beating harder with every step. Inside, the dining room glowed with low chandelier light. Silver gleamed on the table. Crystal glasses caught the gold from the candles. It was beautiful in the same cold way a knife could be beautiful. Gavin Cross was already there. He stood near the bar with a drink in one hand, tall and polished, smiling like he had been waiting for a private joke. When Vivian and Ethan entered, Gavin crossed the room at once. "Well," he said, "this is unexpected." He shook Ethan's hand. His grip tightened just enough to make the message clear. Vivian did not react. "We wanted some privacy." Gavin's smile stayed in place. You never used to care about privacy. He turned to Ethan. And what exactly do you do at the company? Before Ethan could answer, Vivian said, He works in marketing. Gavin's eyes moved back to her. He knew she had stepped in. Ethan could see it. Dinner began. Conversation stayed polished, harmless, expensive. Market expansion. A new client in Chicago. A charity gala next month. But underneath every word, Ethan felt the strain humming like a wire pulled too tight. He sat beside Vivian, close enough to smell the faint, clean scent of her perfume. At one point, while Gavin was talking about leadership, Vivian laid her hand over Ethan's for 2 seconds. It was a perfect gesture. Easy, natural, convincing. It also made his whole body go still. Across the table, Gavin noticed everything. On the drive back to the penthouse, the city lights slid across the windshield in long silver streaks. Vivian kept both hands on the wheel. He doesn't believe us, Ethan said. No, Vivian said. How can you tell? She gave a small, humorless breath. Because Gavin never believes anything I say unless it benefits him. Ethan turned toward the window. That sounds exhausting. It is. That night he lay awake in the guest room staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of the penthouse. For the first time since signing the contract, he understood just how long a year could feel. The next 2 weeks settled into a strange rhythm. Vivian left early. She came home late. They exchanged only what they needed to. Schedules, appearances, timing, logistics. Sometimes he ate dinner alone at the kitchen island while the city glowed beyond the glass. Sometimes he heard her moving down the hall long after midnight, still working, still awake. The place never felt lived in. It felt managed. On weekends, Ethan returned to his old neighborhood to see Daisy. Those hours were the only part of his week that felt solid. At the park, in the grocery store, kneeling to zip her coat, helping her color at the kitchen table, he felt like himself again. Then Sunday night came, and he went back to the penthouse and became a different man. 3 weeks after he moved in, Vivian told him they had another dinner. This one matters more, she said. Gavin invited 2 board members. The restaurant sat high above downtown, all glass walls and white tablecloths. The waiters wore gloves. The menu had no prices. Ethan thought that alone told him everything he needed to know. They arrived early. Vivian wore a black dress that somehow made her look even more untouchable. Ethan wore the same dark suit from the contract signing. He felt like he had borrowed himself from someone richer. Relax, Vivian said as they waited. I am relaxed. She looked at him. No, you look like a man waiting for a court sentence. Close enough. Gavin arrived exactly on time, with 2 older board members behind him. One had silver hair and a voice like gravel. The other looked soft around the middle but sharp in the eyes. Ethan understood at once that both men were there to inspect, not socialize. The evening turned into a performance. How did they meet? At work. How long had they been seeing each other? Long enough to know, why keep it quiet? To avoid gossip. Did Ethan enjoy the business world? He was learning. Vivian touched his hand at the right times. Ethan smiled when he needed to. Gavin watched every glance between them like a man trying to catch a card trick from the wrong angle. Then one of the board members asked, "And marriage suits you, Mr. Cole?" Ethan looked at Vivian before answering. He said, "Some days I still feel surprised by it." The older man laughed. "That sounds honest." Vivian's eyes flicked toward him. For 1 second, something warmer passed through them, but Gavin saw that too. On the drive home, Vivian said nothing. When they reached the penthouse, she kicked off her heels, poured herself a glass of wine, and stood by the window with the skyline spread beneath her. Ethan stayed near the kitchen. "Do you ever stop working?" he asked. She looked out at the city. "Not if I can help it." "That doesn't answer the question." "It does." He leaned against the counter. "You really think your brother will keep digging?" Vivian took a sip of wine. "My brother has spent most of his life waiting for me to fail. If I breathe wrong, he notices." The words were calm, but the weariness behind them was not. Ethan watched her a moment. "You don't have to do the whole Ice Queen act when it's just me." She turned then, one brow lifting. "Ice Queen? You know what I mean. And what do you think I'm doing?" "Surviving," he said. "Same as everybody else. Just in more expensive shoes." For the first time, her mouth almost curved. Not quite a smile, but close enough to count. That same week, a storm rolled through the city. The lights went out just after 10. 1 second, the penthouse was glowing. The next, it dropped into darkness. The hum of appliances died. The windows turned into black mirrors streaked with rain. Ethan found 2 candles in a kitchen drawer and lit them. Their small flames softened the room at once. Vivian came in from the hallway, holding her phone for light. Her expression calm, but her hair slightly loose from the long day. Somehow that small disorder made her look less guarded. He poured them each a drink. They sat on opposite ends of the couch with thunder rolling beyond the glass. For a while they said nothing. Then Vivian asked, "Why did you really agree?" Ethan looked at the candle flame between them. "You know why." "I know the facts," she said. "I asked about the reason." He let out a breath. "Because Daisy deserves more than survival." Rain rattled hard against the windows. He kept his voice low. "I got tired of being one emergency away from losing everything. Tired of pretending I could fix it with hard work and no sleep." Vivian said nothing, so Ethan kept going. "I didn't say yes because I wanted your money. I said yes because I was scared of what happened if I kept saying no to help." The candlelight moved across her face. "Do you regret it?" He thought for a long moment. "I don't know yet." Then he looked at her. "Do you?" Vivian's fingers tightened slightly around her glass. The thunder rolled again, low and heavy, and for the first time since he had met her, Ethan had the feeling she was about to tell him something real. Vivian turned the glass slowly in her hand. The candlelight caught the edge of it and threw a thin line of gold across her face. "No," she said at last. "I don't regret it." Her voice was steady, but something under it was not. She looked toward the dark window. "I would do almost anything to keep Gavin from taking this company. He's spent years waiting for the chance. If he gets control, he'll tear through everything just to prove he can." Ethan leaned back against the couch. "You really hate each other that much?" A small breath left her. "He hates losing more than he hates me. I just happen to be the thing standing in his way." The storm pressed against the glass. The whole penthouse felt smaller in the dark. For the next hour, they talked in a way they never had to before. Vivian told him about growing up in the Cross house, about how Gavin had been prepared for power from the time he was old enough to understand what power was. She had not been prepared for anything. She had been tolerated, corrected, judged, and ignored until her father died and left her the company with a condition that felt more like a punishment than a gift. Ethan told her about Marissa. About the hospital smell that stayed in his clothes. About the last 6 months, when every phone call made his hands shake. About learning how to be both parents while grieving too hard to think straight. When the electricity came back, the room flashed bright all at once. Vivian stood up fast, almost like she had been caught doing something she had not meant to do. At the doorway, she paused. "Thank you," she said. Ethan looked at her. "For what?" But she only gave a small shake of her head and walked away. The next Saturday, Ethan told Vivian at breakfast that he was taking Daisy to the park. He had not meant it as an invitation. He had only been making conversation, which in the penthouse still felt like a new and awkward thing. But Vivian looked up from her coffee and asked, "Can I come?" Ethan blinked. "Why?" She took a second before answering. "Because I want to see what matters to you when none of this is involved." He studied her face. There was no sharpness in it that morning, just something careful. So he said yes. The park sat near a pond on the west side of the city. The wind smelled like wet grass and warm pavement. Daisy ran toward the swings with the kind of joy only little kids and very lucky people still carried. When Vivian arrived, she was wearing jeans, a cream sweater, and no makeup. Her hair was tied back. She looked younger, softer, less like the woman who could silence a boardroom with one look. Daisy spotted her first. "Daddy," she called. "Who's that?" Ethan looked over. Vivian had stopped near the path, almost like she was not sure she should come closer. He cleared his throat. "She's a friend." Vivian walked over and crouched so she was at Daisy's height. "Hi." Daisy studied her with serious 6-year-old suspicion. "Are you my dad's girlfriend?" Ethan nearly choked on the answer. Vivian looked up at him for half a second, and he saw real panic in her eyes for the first time. Then she looked back at Daisy and said gently, "Something like that." Daisy considered this. "Are you going to be my new mom?" The question hit the air and stayed there. Ethan stepped in at once. "No, sweetheart. That's not how it works." Daisy accepted that with surprising ease and ran back to the swings. Vivian stood slowly. For a moment she looked shaken. They walked beside the pond, while Daisy raced ahead, chasing pigeons. "She's amazing," Vivian said quietly. Ethan smiled before he meant to. "Yeah, she is." Vivian watched Daisy run. "She looks happy." "She is when she doesn't know what I'm worried about." Vivian was silent for a few steps. Then she said, "She's lucky to have you." Ethan looked at his daughter, then at the woman beside him. "No, I'm the lucky one." Vivian did not answer. But when she looked at Daisy again, something in her face went still and sad, like she was watching a life she had never been allowed to want. That night, Ethan could not stop thinking about it. Not the question Daisy had asked, the look on Vivian's face after. 2 weeks later, they took wedding photos. It was Vivian's idea. She said Gavin would want proof, evidence, something that looked too personal to be a lie. The photographer met them in a studio downtown with white walls and bright lights that made everything feel too exposed. "Closer," the photographer said. They stepped closer. "Hands together." They obeyed. Sorry, Ethan. Put your arm around her waist." Ethan hesitated. Vivian spoke so softly only he could hear. "It's fine." He set his hand at her waist. She was warm under the fabric of her dress. Not distant, not polished, just warm. "Now look at each other," the photographer said. They did. For one strange second, the whole room dropped away. Ethan looked into Vivian's eyes and saw something he had not expected to find there. Not control, not cool intelligence. Fear. The same kind he carried around in his own chest. The camera clicked. Vivian stepped back at once. The moment shattered. On the drive home, neither of them spoke, but the silence between them had changed. It no longer felt empty. It felt crowded with things neither of them knew how to name. A month later, Gavin made his move. The email went to the whole board. The language was neat and formal. Concerns about executive leadership. Questions about transparency. A request for an emergency meeting. Vivian read it in her office with one hand tight around the edge of the desk. Ethan stood in the doorway and watched her face lose color. "He found something," he said. "He thinks he did," she replied. She set the phone down and looked at him. "He's going to try to prove the marriage is fake." Ethan stepped farther into the room. "And if he does?" Vivian's jaw tightened. "Then he'll try to remove me." The meeting was set for Thursday morning. The night before, Ethan barely slept. Around 3, he got out of bed and went to the kitchen. He poured a glass of water and stood by the window while the city glowed below him like 1,000 distant fires. A few minutes later, he heard footsteps. Vivian stood in the doorway in gray sweatpants and an oversized sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked tired, human, unarmored. "You're awake," he said. "So are you." He gave a weak smile. "Couldn't sleep." "Neither could I." For a moment, they just stood there in the soft kitchen light. Then Ethan asked, "Are you scared?" Vivian let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Yes." The honesty of it hit him harder than he expected. She stepped closer to the counter. "I've spent my whole life trying to prove I belong in rooms that were never built for me. Tomorrow Gavin gets to stand in front of the board and say I don't." "He's wrong." She looked at him. "That's not always the same thing as losing." Ethan set down his glass. "What are you going to do?" Vivian folded her arms like she was holding herself together. "Tell the truth." He stared at her. "I'll tell them the marriage was a contract," she said. "I'll admit everything. Then I'll remind them the clause in my father's will is absurd, controlling, and completely unrelated to whether I can run a company." "And if they still remove you?" Her face went quiet. "Then at least I stop hiding." The words settled between them. Then she looked straight at him and asked the question that had been living underneath everything for weeks. "Why are you still here?" Ethan swallowed. "Gavin offered you a way out. You could have left." He thought about all the answers he could give, the practical ones, the safe ones, the ones that would keep his heart out of it. But standing there in the half-dark, with the city below them and the truth pressing close, he found he could not lie anymore. "Because I'm tired of watching bad people win," he said. Vivian's eyes did not move from his. "And because?" she asked softly. Ethan looked down once, then back at her. Because somewhere along the way, this stopped being just about the contract. Vivian went very still. Neither of them moved. He thought she might step closer. Thought he might. But then she looked away first and said, "Get some sleep. Tomorrow will be ugly." He nodded, though they both knew sleep was no longer likely. The boardroom on the 40th floor was all glass, chrome, and polished wood, the kind of room built to make people feel small while pretending to do the opposite. 7 board members sat around the table when Ethan and Vivian walked in. Gavin was already there, calm and perfectly dressed, looking like a man who had rehearsed victory. Gregory Hale, the board chair, called the meeting to order. After a few formal words, he gave the floor to Gavin. Gavin stood and adjusted his tie. He began with the kind of false respect that sounded worse than open hatred. He said he admired his sister's ambition. He said she had worked hard. He said the board deserved full transparency. Then he opened a folder. One by one, he placed documents on the table: the contract, the bank transfers, the timeline of Ethan's debt being paid, every piece of it laid out in clean lines and quiet cruelty. Gavin looked around the room. My sister hired this man to pose as her husband so she could meet the terms of our father's will. She misled the board. She manipulated company leadership for personal gain, and she has been counting on no one looking closely enough to notice. Silence followed. Every eye in the room turned to Vivian. She stood. Her face was pale, but her voice did not shake. Everything my brother said about the contract is true. A few board members shifted in their seats. Vivian kept going. Yes, I entered into a legal arrangement with Ethan Cole. Yes, I paid his debt. Yes, I did it to satisfy a requirement in my father's will. She looked at each person at the table in turn. And no, I will not apologize for refusing to let an outdated, humiliating clause hand this company to a man who does not deserve it. Gavin opened his mouth, but Vivian cut across him. For 3 years, I have increased revenue, expanded our client base, and stabilized this company in markets my brother never had the patience to understand. If you want to discuss integrity, then discuss the system that made my marital status relevant to corporate leadership in the first place. The room stayed still. Then Gavin said, "This isn't about the clause. It's about fraud." "No," Vivian said. "It's about power, and your anger that I have it." The tension snapped tight across the room. That was when Ethan stood. Gregory frowned. "Mr. Cole, unless this is directly relevant—" "It is," Ethan said. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. But once he started, the fear burned away. 2 weeks ago, Gavin asked to meet with me privately. He offered me a way out. He said if I walked away, he'd bury the contract and let me keep the money. Gavin's face changed for the first time. "That's a lie," he said. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Actually," he said, "it isn't." He pressed play. Gavin's voice filled the room, smooth, confident, offering silence in exchange for betrayal, promising protection if Ethan disappeared. When the recording ended, the quiet in the boardroom felt heavier than before. Gregory looked at Gavin. "Is that your voice?" Gavin's answer came too slowly. "It was taken out of context." "It sounded very clear," one of the board members said. Ethan stepped forward and set another folder on the table. "There's more." Vivian looked at him sharply. She had not known about this part. "I was given access to internal files to help prepare," Ethan said. "While reviewing them, I found records showing Gavin used executive permissions to monitor Vivian's emails, calendar, and internal communication logs for months." Gregory opened the folder. His face hardened line by line. One board member muttered, "Good God." Another said, "This is a direct violation." Gavin straightened. "I was conducting due diligence." "No," Gregory said coldly. "You were spying." The room shifted then, not physically, emotionally. Ethan felt it. For the first time that morning, Gavin no longer looked like the man in control. Ethan turned toward the board. "I know what this arrangement looks like," he said. "But I also know what I've seen. Vivian Cross works harder than anyone in this building. She did what she did because the rules were broken long before she ever touched them." He took a breath. "And for what it's worth, she never manipulated me. She offered me a deal when my life was falling apart. I said yes. That was my decision. But if you're looking for the person who turned this company into a weapon, you're looking at the wrong sibling." Nobody spoke. Gregory finally closed the folder and said the board needed time to deliberate. He asked everyone except the board members to step outside. The hallway felt cold after the pressure of the room. Gavin walked out last. He stopped beside Ethan, his voice low enough for only him to hear. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Ethan looked him right in the eye. "No, you did." Gavin's stare turned flat and dangerous. Then he walked away. Vivian stood a few feet from Ethan, silent. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, but she did not say a word. 30 minutes later, Gregory stepped out. He looked older than he had before. "The board has reached a decision," he said. Vivian's shoulders went still. Gavin Cross is being removed from his board position, effective immediately, for ethical misconduct and abuse of executive access. No one moved. Gregory continued. "You will retain executive control pending legal review of the will. However, the marriage contract must be dissolved within 30 days. We will begin the process of challenging the marriage clause itself." He paused, then looked at Vivian. "It is not a perfect outcome, but it is the most responsible one." Then he turned to Ethan. "You stood up when it mattered. Not many people do." Gregory went back into the boardroom. The door closed. Vivian and Ethan stood alone in the hallway, victory settling over them in a shape neither of them had expected. Vivian looked at him. "Thank you," she said. Ethan gave a small shake of his head. "You don't need to keep saying that." "Yes," she said quietly. "I do." They walked to the parking garage together in silence. At her car, Vivian turned to face him. "The contract is over," she said. He nodded. "I know. You're free to go." The words were simple, clean, reasonable. But the look in her eyes was none of those things. Ethan glanced away for a moment. "I need to figure out what comes next." Vivian nodded once. "So do I." Then she got into her car and drove away. He stood there long after her taillights vanished. They had won. But it did not feel like winning. It felt like losing something he had only just realized he wanted to keep. 2 weeks later, Ethan moved out of the penthouse. Vivian was not there when he carried the last bag to the elevator. She had said goodbye the night before, standing in the doorway of his room, looking composed in the way people do when they are trying not to come apart. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she had said. He had almost laughed at that, because he was starting to think he already had. Back in his old apartment, life resumed its old shape. He picked up Daisy from daycare, made boxed macaroni and cut apple slices, read her a bedtime story while she leaned against his side. The apartment was cramped. The wallpaper was still peeling. The bills still existed. But now there was something missing from the air, and Ethan felt it everywhere. In the quiet after Daisy fell asleep, in the empty hour after dinner, in the space beside him when he lay down at night. 3 days later, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Vivian. "Can we meet? Not as your boss. Not as your ex-wife, just as me. Ethan stared at the screen for a long time. Then he typed one word. Yes. They met at a coffee shop on the east side. Nothing fancy. Mismatched chairs, warm lights, music a little too loud. The kind of place where people looked ordinary on purpose. Vivian was already there by the window with a cup of tea in front of her. She wore jeans and a white shirt. No makeup. Hair tied back. She looked nervous. Ethan had never seen her look nervous. He sat across from her. "Hi." "Hi," she said. For a second, neither of them seemed to know what came next. Then Vivian wrapped both hands around her cup and looked down at the steam. "I've been thinking," she said, "about everything." Ethan waited. She lifted her eyes to his. "I spent so much time pretending with you that somewhere in the middle, I stopped knowing what was performance and what wasn't." His chest tightened. Vivian took a breath. "I know how all of this began. I know it was a contract. I know it was built on pressure and fear and things neither of us would have chosen under normal circumstances." She paused. "But I also know there were moments that felt real. The storm, the park, the kitchen, the way you stood beside me when leaving would have been easier." Ethan said nothing. He was afraid anything he said too soon might break the moment. Vivian looked almost frustrated with herself now, like honesty was still a language she had to force through. "I don't know what this would look like without the contract," she said. "Without the company between us, without rules and pretending and deadlines." She swallowed. "But I want to find out." The room around them seemed to fall away. She gave a small, shaky smile. "If you do too." Ethan looked at her. Really looked. At the woman who had stood in front of a boardroom and refused to bow. The woman who had sat with him in the dark and told him about being invisible. The woman who had looked at his daughter with a softness she had probably spent her whole life trying to hide. He smiled before he meant to. "Yeah," he said. "I do." Something opened in her face then, not relief exactly. Something warmer, deeper, real. Vivian let out the breath she had been holding. "Good," she said. Then, with the faintest trace of humor in her voice, she asked the question that had started everything. "So, are we sharing a bed?" Ethan laughed. The sound came out softer than he expected. "Maybe," he said. "But not tonight." Vivian smiled. A real one this time. Not polished. Not controlled. Just hers. "That's fair." They stayed there a while after that, drinking coffee and tea and talking about nothing important. Daisy's dinosaur obsession. Bad office coffee. Favorite takeout. The kind of ordinary things people talk about when they are finally done pretending to be strangers. And for the first time since they had met, that was exactly what they were not. No contract. No performance. No one watching. Just two people, a little bruised, a little uncertain, and honest at last about wanting the same thing. Ethan sat across from Vivian Cross and felt something quiet settle inside him. Not certainty, not safety. Something better, hope. If you believe stories still matter, go ahead and hit subscribe. Stories Beyond the Porch. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Thanks for watching.